May 1945. The Third Reich had collapsed into dust and ash. Germany lay broken across Europe like a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting a different kind of ruin. In Hamburg, entire neighborhoods had vanished into rubble mountains 3 stories high. In Berlin, children dug through debris looking for anything to eat. The Nazi propaganda machine that once screamed promises of final victory from every radio and poster had gone silent. Those promises were lies. Everyone knew it now. The cities were skeletal remains. The food was gone. Clean water was a memory. The infrastructure that once moved millions of soldiers and tons of supplies had been bombed into twisted metal and broken concrete. And in this chaos, approximately 15,000 German women who had served the Wehrmacht now found themselves prisoners of war. Why are they so polite? This question would haunt them from the very first moments of capture. These weren't combat soldiers. They were the helpers, the support staff, the ones who kept the war machine running from behind the lines. They were radio operators who relayed coded messages, anti-aircraft gunners who tracked Allied bombers through the night sky, clerks who filed reports and managed supply requisitions, nurses who bandaged wounded soldiers. They wore uniforms, they took orders, they believed, or at least they had believed, in what they were told. They had spent years absorbing Nazi ideology through training sessions, propaganda films, and the constant drumbeat of messages about German superiority and Allied barbarism. The British were monsters in these stories. Savage, cruel, the kind of enemy that would torture and execute prisoners without mercy. Elfriede Müller was 22 years old. She came from Hamburg, from a neighborhood that no longer existed. For 4 years, she had worked as a signals operator, sitting in concrete bunkers with headphones clamped over her ears, transcribing military communications in careful handwriting. She was good at her job, reliable, the kind of person officers trusted to get details right, but all that was over now. Her unit had retreated north as the Reich crumbled, moving through the spring countryside, while refugees clogged the roads and rumors of surrender spread like wildfire. They ended up near Flensburg, in the last tiny pocket of German-controlled territory. There was nowhere left to go. The order came down on May 7th, unconditional surrender. Lay down your weapons. Wait for the Allies. Elfriede and the other women in her unit waited in a converted school building. They had burned their most sensitive documents. They had packed their few belongings into rucksacks. They had argued in whispers about what would happen next. Some believed the horror stories completely. The British would separate them, interrogate them, maybe worse. Others thought surrender might mean slave labor, shipped off to England to work in factories as payment for Germany's crimes. A few hoped for quick processing and release, though nobody really believed that. Mostly they just waited, watching the road through dirty windows, jumping at every sound. The British military police arrived in trucks on a grey morning when fog still clung to the ground. Elfriede heard the engines first, that deep rumble of military vehicles moving in convoy. Her stomach clenched. This was it. This was the moment when everything she had been told would be tested. She lined up with the others outside the building, standing at attention, because that was what you did, even in defeat. The truck stopped. Doors opened. British soldiers in neat uniforms climbed out, carrying clipboards and paperwork instead of drawn weapons. A sergeant walked toward them. He was perhaps 40 years old, with a weathered face and tired eyes. He looked at the assembled women for a long moment. Then he spoke in accented but clear German. "Please step down carefully, miss." He said it to the woman nearest the truck, offering his hand to help her climb down from where she had been told to wait. Not barked orders, not shouted commands. Not violence or threats. Please. The word hung in the air like something alien. Elfriede felt her face twist in confusion. She looked at the woman next to her and saw the same bewilderment reflected back. This had to be a trap. This had to be some kind of trick. The British were playing a game, lulling them into compliance before the real treatment began. But the sergeant just kept speaking in that same calm, almost gentle tone. "Please form 2 lines. Thank you for your cooperation. We will process your paperwork and then transport you to a temporary holding facility. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Does anyone require medical attention?" The questions were genuine. The tone was professional but not cruel. When an older woman stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, a British soldier reached out to steady her elbow. "Careful now, easy does it." Elfriede watched this happen and felt something crack inside her understanding of the world. She had been trained for brutality. She had steeled herself for dehumanization. She had prepared to be treated the way German forces treated their prisoners, which was to say without mercy or dignity. Instead, she was being asked to cooperate, politely, with please and thank you, as if she were a person deserving of basic courtesy rather than a defeated enemy. The other women whispered to each other as they climbed into the trucks for transport. What is happening? Why are they acting like this? Is this how they soften us up before the real punishment? Nobody had an answer. They had no framework for understanding kindness from an enemy. The Nazi system had taught them that power meant dominance, that strength required cruelty, that showing any consideration for the defeated was weakness. But here were the victors, the ones who had just won the war, saying please. And as the engines started and they began to move, Elfriede realized she had no idea what kind of world she was entering. The trucks carried them south through the German countryside for 3 hours. Elfriede sat on a hard wooden bench in the back of the transport vehicle, surrounded by other women who spoke in whispers or did not speak at all. Through the open canvas flaps, she could see the landscape rolling past. Farmhouses with missing roofs, fields that should have been planted but lay empty, bridges that ended halfway across rivers, their spans blown apart and dangling into the water below. Everything was broken. Everything bore the marks of war. The British guards riding with them said nothing except to offer water from canteens when the sun grew hot. They did not threaten, they did not mock. They simply rode in silence, occasionally checking papers or making notes on clipboards. Camp 186 appeared through the truck windows near Munsterlager as a sprawling collection of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing. Guard towers stood at the corners, manned but not menacing. The trucks pulled through the main gate and stopped in a large assembly area where approximately 4,000 German female prisoners of war were already housed. Elfriede climbed down from the truck, expecting to be shouted at, to be herded like cattle, to be processed like cargo. Instead, a British officer with a clipboard approached and said in careful German, "Good morning, ladies. Welcome to Camp 186. We will get you registered, assigned to barracks, and fed. Please form a single line, and we will begin processing. Good morning. Welcome, please." The words continued to strike Elfriede as wrong, as impossible, as some kind of elaborate deception. She formed the line with the others. When her turn came, a British clerk asked her name, her age, her hometown, her military assignment. He wrote everything down in neat handwriting. He did not interrogate her. He did not demand information about operations or strategies. He simply filled out forms. When he finished, he looked up and said, "Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Müller. Barracks 7, Bunk 14. Dinner is at 6 o'clock. Next, please." "Thank you, Miss Müller." Not prisoner, not number. Her name, spoken with basic respect, as if she were a person who deserved to be addressed as a human being rather than an enemy to be crushed. The barracks were simple wooden structures with rows of bunk beds, thin mattresses, and grey wool blankets. Nothing luxurious, but clean and dry and structurally sound. Elfriede chose her assigned bunk and sat down on it slowly, testing the mattress. It was firmer than what she had slept on during the final chaotic months of the war, when her unit had moved from place to place, sleeping in barns or abandoned buildings or sometimes on the ground. A woman in the bunk across from her introduced herself as Greta, a former nurse from Munich. "Have you noticed?" Greta whispered. "They have not hit anyone. They have not shouted. What kind of prison camp is this?" Morning roll call the next day brought more impossible scenes. The British guards walked down the rows of assembled prisoners, counting, checking names against lists. One guard held an umbrella over an elderly woman when light rain began to fall. The woman looked up at him with confusion written across her weathered face. The guard simply smiled slightly and said, "Can't have you catching cold, now can we?" Another guard wished them all good morning before beginning the count. When he finished, he said, "Thank you for your cooperation. Breakfast will be served in 20 minutes. Dismissed. The dining hall shocked Elfriede more than anything else so far. Long tables stretched across a large room. British staff stood behind serving counters with huge pots of food. Real food, porridge with milk. White bread that was actually white, not the grey sawdust mixture they had eaten for the past year. Margarine, jam that was red and sweet-smelling. Tinned meat that came in uniform portions. Tea that was hot and strong, served with real milk and sugar cubes. Elfriede stared at her tray as if it were an illusion. She had been surviving on thin soup and moldy bread. German civilians outside the camp wire were starving on roughly 1,000 calories per day, digging through garbage for potato peels. Here, British staff served approximately 2,800 calories per day to their prisoners. A British cook noticed her staring and said in broken German, "Eat is good, hot." Then he apologized because the porridge was slightly lumpy, apologized to a prisoner for imperfect porridge. Elfriede sat down at a table and ate slowly, tasting each bite, unable to believe what was happening. Around her, other women did the same, exchanging glances that asked the same silent question over and over. Why are they treating us this way? With each passing day, the strangeness only grew. Prisoners were assigned work duties, but the work was reasonable, and the treatment during it defied everything they had known. Elfriede was sent to a repair workshop where prisoners mended damaged British uniforms and equipment. The work area was organized with German precision but British efficiency. Supplies were stored in labeled bins. Thread came in dozens of colors, all neatly arranged. Scissors and needles were distributed each morning and collected each evening, but this was done with polite requests rather than accusations of potential theft. The British quartermaster, who oversaw the workshop, explained the work patiently, demonstrated techniques, and then said, "Any questions? No? Right then, carry on. Let me know if you need anything." Elfriede had spent 4 years in a military system built on screaming and fear. Officers shouted orders. Failure brought punishment. Questions were seen as weakness or insubordination. But here, the British staff acted as if cooperation was assumed rather than demanded. They acted as if treating people with basic decency was simply normal behavior, not a special privilege to be earned. The medical care was equally incomprehensible. When Elfriede developed an infection in a small cut on her hand, she was sent to the camp infirmary. A British nurse examined the wound, cleaned it carefully with antiseptic that stung but worked, and then applied real penicillin cream. Penicillin, the miracle drug that Germany had never managed to mass produce. The nurse wrapped the hand in clean white bandages and said, "Keep it dry for 3 days, Miss Müller. Come back if it gets worse." She used Elfriede's name. She provided treatment that was modern and effective. She treated the injury as important, not as something to be ignored unless it became life-threatening. Educational opportunities appeared on bulletin boards throughout the camp. English language classes, 3 times per week. Vocational training in typing, bookkeeping, sewing. A British education officer stopped Elfriede one afternoon and said, "You should consider the typing course. You will need skills for rebuilding when you return home. Not punishment, not forced labor. Skills for rebuilding. The assumption that there would be a normal life after this, that learning and growth were still possible, that the future existed beyond defeat and destruction." One evening, during an inspection, a British officer noticed Elfriede shivering in the cool air. She had given her spare sweater to another prisoner whose clothing had been lost during transport. The officer returned 20 minutes later with a wool blanket. "Here you are," he said simply. "Can't have you catching cold, can we? Stay warm." Then he walked away before she could respond. Greta whispered to her that night in the barracks, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "They treat us better than our own officers did. Better than our own government did. What does that mean?" Elfriede had no answer, but she felt something beginning to crack inside her understanding of the world, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. December 25th, 1945. Christmas morning arrived cold and clear at Camp 186, with frost covering the ground like scattered diamonds and breath forming white clouds in the air. Elfriede woke to the sound of activity outside the barracks, voices speaking in English with an energy that seemed unusual for the early hour. She pulled on her wool coat and stepped outside with Greta and several other women to see what was happening. British soldiers were unloading trucks filled with evergreen trees, real Christmas trees that filled the air with the sharp, clean scent of pine. Other soldiers carried boxes of decorations, strings of lights, and supplies whose purpose was not immediately clear. The prisoners watched in silence, confused about what this meant. A British officer approached the gathered women and announced in German, "Today is Christmas. We will have a celebration this evening with dinner and decorations. You are invited to help prepare if you wish, or you may simply attend. This is a day of peace." He smiled slightly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world, as if prisoners and captors celebrating together made perfect sense. Throughout the day, volunteers helped decorate the main dining hall and the assembly building. The Christmas trees were erected and adorned with handmade ornaments that other prisoners had crafted from scraps of colored paper and fabric. British soldiers strung lights along the walls, tested them until they glowed warm and golden, then stepped back to admire their work. The prisoners worked alongside their guards, passing decorations back and forth, occasionally exchanging words in broken German or English, creating something that resembled normalcy in a place that should have been defined by division and defeat. Elfriede found herself standing next to a young British private who was struggling to hang a paper star on a high branch. She reached up and secured it for him, being taller. He looked at her with surprise, then smiled and said, "Cheers, thank you." She nodded, unable to form words, still processing the strangeness of this collaboration. In her 4 years of military service, she had never worked alongside the enemy for any purpose, let alone to create something beautiful. Evening came and the dining hall transformed into something Elfriede had not seen in years. The lights glowed softly, the trees stood decorated and dignified in the corners. Long tables had been arranged with actual tablecloths, white and clean. British staff began bringing out food, and the smell that filled the hall made Elfriede's eyes water. Roast beef, real beef, cooked until it was brown and tender. Potatoes that were not rotten or partially frozen. Vegetables that had color, green beans and carrots that looked like they came from a cookbook rather than from desperate scrounging. Gravy in large serving bowls, fresh bread that was still warm, and then, impossibly, plum pudding for dessert, rich and dark and sweet. Each prisoner received a portion that would have fed a German civilian family for 3 days. The contrast stabbed at Elfriede's mind like a knife. Outside these camp walls, German children were starving. Mothers traded jewelry for moldy potatoes. People ate tulip bulbs and tree bark to survive. But here, the victorious British were serving their defeated enemies a feast, not scraps, not leftovers. A genuine Christmas dinner with all the traditional elements. But the moment that truly shattered something deep inside, Elfriede came with the small packages distributed after the meal. Each prisoner received 4 ounces of real chocolate in brown wrappers and 1 fresh orange. Elfriede held the orange in both hands and stared at it. She had not seen citrus fruit in 3 years. The bright orange color seemed almost unreal against the gray and brown tones that had dominated her life for so long. The weight of it in her palm, the slight roughness of the peel, the faint sweet smell that rose from the skin, all of it was a reminder of a world that had existed before the war, a world she had almost forgotten. The chocolate was smooth and dark, the kind that melted slowly on the tongue. She broke off a small square and let it dissolve in her mouth, closing her eyes against the flood of memory it triggered. Birthdays before the war, Christmas mornings when such things were normal rather than miraculous. A childhood that felt impossibly distant now. Colonel Hartford, the camp commandant, stood at the front of the dining hall after the meal concluded. He was a tall man in his 50s with grey at his temples and a serious but not unkind expression. The hall fell silent as he prepared to speak. His German was formal but clear, carefully pronounced. "You are prisoners, yes, but you are also human beings deserving of dignity," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "We do not celebrate tonight because we have defeated you. We celebrate because the war is over, and now we can all begin rebuilding a better world. The fighting has ended. The dying has ended. What remains is the work of healing and reconstruction, and that work requires all of us to remember our shared humanity. Merry Christmas, and God bless you all." The words hung in the air. Some prisoners wiped at their eyes, Others sat frozen, unable to process what they had just heard. Elfriede felt something inside her chest crack wide open, like ice breaking on a frozen lake. She had been taught that enemies were subhuman. She had absorbed messages about British barbarism and cruelty for years. She had believed, or tried to believe, that the Nazi system's harshness was necessary for strength. But here stood a British colonel who had every right to treat them with contempt, instead speaking about shared humanity and dignity and rebuilding together. That night, Elfriede sat on her bunk with a small notebook she had been given by the camp education office. She began to write, slowly at first, then faster as the thoughts poured out. "I was taught the British were monsters," she wrote. "I was told they would torture us, execute us, treat us with savage cruelty. But instead they say please when asking us to work. They say thank you when we comply. They apologize when they inconvenience us. They provided us with a Christmas feast while our own people starve. They gave us chocolate and oranges, gifts that have no practical purpose except to bring joy. Our own system was built on shouting, on fear, on brutality. We were told this made us strong. We were told that kindness was weakness and that only through hardness could a nation be great. But which system actually won the war? The one that treated people like machines to be used and discarded, or the one that remembered they were human beings even when those humans were enemies?" She paused, staring at the words on the page. Then she continued, "If Britain can afford to treat its prisoners this way, feeding us better than we fed ourselves during the war, providing medical care and education and basic dignity, then how vast must the gap have been? How much stronger were they all along? We were told we were superior. We were told we would triumph through will and discipline and racial strength, but they had real abundance. They had functioning systems. They had industrial capacity we could not match. And more than that, they had something we never understood. They had the confidence that comes from genuine strength. They can afford to be polite because they have nothing to prove. They can afford kindness because they are secure in their power." The understanding moved through her thoughts like water seeping into every crack. Everything she had believed was built on lies, not small lies, but fundamental ones. The daily politeness from the guards was not weakness. It was the behavior of people who knew they had already won, who had no need for cruelty to establish their dominance. The Nazi system had screamed and threatened and brutalized because it was built on fear and insecurity. It had to constantly prove its strength because that strength was hollow at its core. Greta leaned over from the next bunk. "What are you writing?" she asked quietly. "The truth," Elfriede said. "Finally, the truth. That we were lied to about everything. That the nation we served confused cruelty with strength. That true power is what we see here. Knowing you can destroy your enemy and choosing instead to offer them dignity." Around the barracks, other women lay awake in their bunks, thinking similar thoughts they might never fully speak aloud. The Christmas celebration had accomplished something that no amount of propaganda or force could achieve. It had revealed which civilization was actually superior, not through violence or domination, but through simple human decency, extended even to those who had fought against them. August 1947. The train carrying Elfriede and hundreds of other repatriated prisoners rolled slowly into Hamburg's main station through a landscape that looked like photographs of the moon. 2 years had passed since Germany's surrender, but the city remained a corpse, propped up and pretending to breathe. The station itself was a hollow shell, with half its roof missing, open to the grey sky above. Pigeons nested in the exposed steel beams. Rain had stained the remaining walls with long streaks of rust and mold. As the train came to a stop with a screech of brakes, Elfriede pressed her face against the window and tried to recognize anything familiar. She could not. The Hamburg she remembered existed only in memory now. Stepping onto the platform felt like entering another world, or perhaps like returning to the real world after living in a dream. The contrast hit her immediately, physically, like walking into a wall. Camp 186 had been organized and clean and structured. Here, chaos ruled everything. Crowds of desperate people pushed past each other, some arriving, some departing, most just existing in the station because it offered shelter. Children with legs like sticks and eyes like empty wells sat against walls and stared at nothing. A woman in a torn coat tried to trade a silver necklace for a moldy loaf of bread while the merchant shook his head. The smell of unwashed bodies and open sewage and rot hung in the air like fog. Elfriede carried a worn rucksack containing everything she owned. 2 changes of clothes, both given to her by the British. A toothbrush and small bar of soap. The English-German dictionary that a guard had gifted her during her final week at camp, inscribed inside the cover with his name and the words, "For your future studies, best wishes." Certificates from the vocational training courses she had completed, typing and bookkeeping and advanced sewing, all printed on official British military paper and signed by instructors. And something less tangible but more valuable, a completely transformed understanding of power, civilization, and what separated strength from brutality. The walk from the station to where her family's apartment building had once stood took 40 minutes through streets that were more rubble than road. Every few blocks, cleared paths wound between mountains of debris that rose 2 or 3 stories high. Brick dust covered everything, mixing with coal smoke from makeshift stoves to create a gritty film that coated the skin and got into the throat. People had built shelters in the ruins, using sheets of corrugated metal and salvaged wood to create lean-tos against the few walls that remained standing. Laundry hung from wires stretched between broken buildings. Children played in the rubble, their games involving which pieces of shrapnel were most valuable for trading. The address where Elfriede had grown up no longer existed as a physical location. The entire block had been obliterated by firebombing, probably in 1943, based on what neighbors told her when she finally found someone who remembered her family. The buildings had burned so hot that the rubble had fused together in places, creating strange, glossy surfaces where stone had melted and reformed. Her parents were alive, the neighbor said, living in a basement shelter 3 blocks west. Her 2 younger brothers had survived as well. She should go to them quickly before dark, because the streets were not safe at night. The basement shelter was a concrete hole in the ground that had once been the foundation of a shop. Approximately 15 people lived there in a space meant for storing supplies. Her family occupied one corner, marked off by hanging blankets for privacy. When Elfriede pushed through the blanket entrance, her mother looked up from a pot of thin soup she was stirring over a small fire made from broken furniture. The recognition took a moment. Then her mother's face crumpled and she began to cry, though no sound came out at first. They embraced while the soup threatened to boil over. Her father was thinner than she remembered, his face all angles and shadows. Her younger brothers, 16 and 14 now, looked like men who had aged too quickly, with adult hardness in their eyes. The younger one, Klaus, had been 12 when she last saw him, still a child despite the Hitler Youth uniform. Now he looked at her with suspicion mixed with relief. "You survived," he said, and it was not entirely a question. They shared the soup that evening, which was mostly water, with a few potato pieces, and something that might have been cabbage. Elfriede contributed a small tin of meat from her rucksack, part of the rations the British had provided for the journey home. Her family stared at the tin as if it were gold. When opened and divided 5 ways, it added perhaps 1 spoonful of protein to each bowl. They ate in silence, too hungry for conversation. Later, after the meal, Klaus confronted her in the corner that served as sleeping quarters. His voice was low and angry. "You were captured by the enemy and they turned you," he said. "You came back speaking their language, carrying their papers, believing their lies. You were supposed to resist. You were supposed to stay loyal." Elfriede looked at her brother, at this boy who had been fed Nazi propaganda from age 6 until the collapse, who had been taught that strength meant never admitting weakness or showing mercy. She chose her words carefully. "No," she said quietly. "They did not turn me. They showed me what we were told was impossible. That strength does not require cruelty. That organization does not require brutality. That you can maintain discipline without dehumanizing people. We were taught that politeness was weakness, that kindness was bourgeois softness, that only through hardness could a nation be great. But Klaus, the nation that said please and thank you, ended the war with their cities still standing and their industries still producing. The nation that worshipped strength through cruelty ended as ash and ruin. Look around you. Look at where we are living. Who was actually stronger? Klaus turned away, his jaw tight. He was not ready to hear this. Perhaps he would never be ready. But the seed was planted. The following months were hard in ways that Camp 186 had not prepared her for. Finding work was difficult when every job had 50 desperate applicants. Food remained scarce, distributed through British occupation authorities who controlled the rations with careful bureaucracy. The black market thrived for those who had goods to trade, but Elfriede had nothing except her skills. Eventually, her English language ability and typing certificates secured her a position as a translator and clerk for the British military government office that oversaw reconstruction efforts in Hamburg's district. Working for the occupation forces brought judgment from some Germans who saw it as collaboration. But it also brought regular meals, a small salary, and a front-row seat to the difference between systems. The British administrators operated with methodical efficiency, tracking supply distributions, organizing rubble removal, coordinating with engineers to restore water and electrical systems. There was paperwork for everything, forms in triplicate, accountability at every level. It was bureaucracy, yes, but it was bureaucracy that functioned. It was the opposite of the Nazi system, where connections and corruption determined who got resources, where orders came down from above without explanation, where chaos was covered up with propaganda about German efficiency. One afternoon in 1949, Elfriede sat in the office during a break and wrote in her journal, a habit she had maintained since that Christmas night in camp. Her English had improved dramatically, but she still wrote in German, organizing her thoughts about the previous 4 years. We were told politeness was weakness, she wrote, that kindness was something only weak nations could afford, that strong nations had to be hard and cruel to survive. But this was backwards. The British could afford to be polite to their prisoners because they had nothing to prove. They had real industrial power, real organizational capacity, real strength. They did not need to scream and threaten because they were confident in their actual capabilities. The Nazi system screamed and brutalized because it was built on insecurity and fear. It had to constantly perform strength because that strength was hollow. True power is quiet. True power can say please and thank you because it does not need to constantly remind people who is in charge. Years later, working as a senior translator for the British Reconstruction Administration, Elfriede would often think back to that first moment of capture, to the sergeant who said please, to the accumulation of small courtesies that had dismantled her understanding of the world more effectively than any interrogation could have. She shared these thoughts with younger Germans who grew up after the war, who needed to understand what had actually happened and why. The British did not break us with kindness, she told them. They simply revealed what strength actually looks like. They proved which civilization was superior, not through force or domination, but by demonstrating that power and decency are not opposites. They are inseparable. A system built on cruelty and fear can win battles through brutality, but it cannot build anything lasting. It cannot create genuine loyalty. It cannot inspire people to be their best selves. The most devastating weapon against totalitarian ideology is not force. It is treating your enemies better than their own system treated them. Those simple words, please and thank you, accomplished what propaganda never could. They revealed the truth. Her younger brother Klaus eventually came to understand this as well, though it took years. The moment of his change came when he needed help from the British administration and was treated with the same basic courtesy that had shocked Elfriede years before. He came home that evening and said simply, "You were right. I see it now." That was enough. The lesson remained. True civilization is measured not by how you treat your friends or your allies, but by how you treat those who are completely in your power, who cannot resist or retaliate, who are at your mercy. The British had passed that test. The Nazi system had failed it catastrophically, and anyone who learned that lesson carried it forward into whatever world they would build next.